Welcome to our panel, on which we will have General Richardson, Commander of the U.S. Southern Command. We will have Bill Cassidy, representing Louisiana and the force behind the Americas Act. And we will have Senator Sheldon Whitehouse from Rhode Island, and a person who has been fighting kleptocrats for a long time. Transparency International claims that after the pandemic, the fight against corruption has stalled. Others, such as Raymond Baker, consider that has actually has lost ground and that corruption is increasing. In the case of Venezuela, from where I come, corruption has generated a lot of suffering. In the late 90s, disgust with corruption fueled the populist movement that generated the decay of the institutions through an autocracy. And now we're seeing a huge amount of migrants in the region. More than 7 million people have left Venezuela to other Southern American countries, and a lot of migrants coming to the US. Last year only, 500,000 people crossed the Darien Gap, out of which 60% were Venezuelans coming to the southern border. So the border crisis that has been discussed in other panels has a lot to do with Venezuela, and the crisis in Venezuela has a lot to do with corruption. Today, we're going to explore the tensions and the opportunities to fight corruption using transparency, but also other tools. So for initial remarks, I would like to give the word to General Richardson, Commander of the U.S. Southern Command.
Well, thank you, Roberto. And thank you to the McCain Institute for everything that you all do for democracy, for human rights, the rule of law. And it's my honor to be the commander of the U.S. Southern Command and responsible for the Caribbean, Central America, and South America, and working with the militaries and public security forces that are in the region. My main lever is security cooperation. We do a lot of exercises, conferences, all based in human rights, the rule of law, and professionalization of their military forces. And so in this region, 28 like-minded democracies, and it's just full of just the human capital in the region, the resources in the region. This region has a lot to offer. There was a lot of talk about this region about 10 years ago and about 2014 about how the region is able to have the potential to feed and fuel the world. I say that again, to feed and fuel the world. And when you look at the resources that are there and the activity by some of our strategic competitors, it seems like they have already realized that. And I would really say that this region is already feeding and fueling the world. They're just not receiving the benefits of it. And so when you look at the heavy crude out of Venezuela, the light sweet crude that was discovered in Guyana, off the shores of Guyana, the fastest growing economy, 25% GDP growth for the next 5 years is anticipated. Soybean, over 50% of the soybean for the globe comes out of the region. Over 30% of the corn, the sugar. It's just amazing. 60% of the world's lithium is in this region. Gold, copper, all of the rare earths. But yet, you see a lot of insecurity. And I would say that economic insecurity fuels poverty. It fuels irregular migration. We see the irregular migration numbers are off the charts, historical numbers. Families can't get food. They can't get health care. They don't feel safe. I've been to the migrant shelters in Colombia, in Panama, in Guatemala. I've met with families, asked them, where are you going? Why are you going? And they're going to America. They want a house. They want to buy a car. They want to be safe. They want to buy food. They want to have health care. And they just want to be a family. They want to realize the American dream. But I would say, how do we help the Americas Instead of it being the American dream, how do we make it the America's dream? And so as we see, 31 countries, 11 territories and dependencies in the region, 22 of these countries have signed on to China's Belt and Road Initiative. Billions of dollars in projects. I think that buyer's remorse is starting to take hold in the region with shoddy projects, cost overruns, all of the ties, the predatory loans, all of those sorts of things are starting to, countries are starting to become wise to that. But in some cases, they have no choice. They have no choice because there's no alternative. And their economies have been really and severely impacted by COVID. And then that has allowed the transnational criminal organizations who've gotten more powerful, over $300 billion annual revenue business. And it's not just trafficking of drugs anymore, it's trafficking of people, which is almost just as profitable. Illegal mining, illegal logging, illegal fishing, counterfeit goods. And then that opens the door for our malign state actors, China, Russia, Iran, to flourish. And so how do we realize the potential for this region? And so that's why I think it's just a great topic here at the McCain Institute today, because we're getting, I think we have some initiatives that are out there. But again, Team USA, bringing all the instruments of national power for Team USA. When I say that, talking about the acronym DIME, diplomacy, information, military, and economics. And so what I've been doing over the past couple of years is partnering with all of the Team USA interagency, Department of Commerce, Department of Treasury, AmCham, all the AmChams that are in the region, our US companies in the region. Why aren't they competing on critical infrastructure in the countries in Latin America and the Caribbean? We've got the PRC with the Belt and Road Initiative in the red zone to our US homeland. Why are our US companies competing on critical infrastructure? So how do we make it easier when we already have all the instruments of national power? Our foreign direct investment in the region as well is already there. Our military is there. We can do better on the information environment, I will say that. And then diplomacy, our diplomats. We got to make sure our US ambassadors are in the seat, in their positions, and that we don't have years worth of gaps. Having our #1 diplomat who's responsible for our ground game in the seat in these countries, and it's globally. So with that, Roberto, I'm really excited to be on the panel. Thank you.
Thank you, General. I would like to ask Senator Cassidy to also give us his initial remarks.
Yeah. So you have to ask yourself, why do we want transparency? Okay, we all kind of know what it is, but let's make it explicit. If you have transparency, you're more likely to have economic development. Economic development is more likely to stabilize the democracy, and a stable democracy is more likely to lead to liberty. That is a virtuous cycle. I've introduced something called the Americas Act, which begins with transparency and the desire to create that virtuous cycle. And just for context, the U.S. has not had a cogent policy towards the Western Hemisphere since JFK. Congress has not done this. So every 4 years, a new president comes in, puts in his priorities, and then it quickly gets swept away. I'm seeing an ambassador there who can agree with this. It quickly gets swept away by events in Asia or Europe, and all of a sudden, that which was initiated with a good cause, with a good intent, is now kind of forgotten about. With our Americas Act, we're hoping that Congress puts forward a policy that has momentum through administrations. What are the components? Transparency. First, we put in an e-governance system, giving incentives for countries to participate in. What's e-governance mean? Well, that means, and they do this in pieces in some Latin American countries. Estonia is the example of where they do everything. But for example, in Guatemala, it has the largest segment of its society in the informal sector, because if you want to register your business, it takes months. You have to pay people under the table, have to pay an attorney. It doesn't happen. People never register, so they don't pay taxes. As a percent of their economy, Guatemala gets the lowest amount in taxes. That's bad. In our e-governance, imagine if you wanted to register a business. You go to register your business, and instead of a consideration beneath the table, you log on. You register your business. Walmart decides to hire you as a vendor. So Walmart can log on and see, oh, they've registered their business and they're paying taxes. As opposed to what happened to Walmart. They went with a vendor who said they were registered, they were not, and the government busted Walmart for contracting with the vendor who was not registered. We addressed that. So they've registered their business now. Guatemala government is getting tax receipts, which it can use to invest in physical and human infrastructure. It attracts more foreign direct investment, more prosperity, stronger democracy, more liberty, fewer people moving to the United States. That's a virtuous cycle begun by transparency. In our bill, we start off with e-governance. We then have provisions to encourage foreign direct investment, which quite logically leads to more trade. That's the third pillar. And the fourth pillar is a people-to-people, where our cultural exchange strengthens those ties. Net result is a more prosperous Latin America, fewer people with more stable democracies, fewer people leaving their homes to migrate to the U.S.-Mexican border, and by the way, stronger ties between the United States and those countries, weakening the ties they have with China. Some of this has been inspired by what Xi has said in the past, and we think this fits very hand in glove with what you have spoken of in terms of how Team USA needs to respond to how Xi euphemistically puts it, strategic opponents.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Whitehouse, initial remarks?
I start from the proposition that Samuel Huntington was right about us being in a clash of civilizations. But the frontier in that clash is a little bit different than he proposed. For me, the frontier is between rule of law versus rule of crime. In a word, kleptocracy. So I've been working in the Senate to attack that problem. We first got a very significant bipartisan beneficial ownership law passed so that U.S. shell corporations were no longer the refuge of choice for international criminals and kleptocrats. That gives us a little bit of credibility as well to push other countries to improve. We just got my law passed to criminalize the extorter in the foreign government, not just the American company that pays the bribe. Mm-hmm. So that's teed up DOJ to go after a whole new array of crooked criminals. With a lot of pushing, the government has stood up KleptoCapture, which is the better organized enterprise for going after oligarch assets and seizing them and bringing them into our control. FinCEN has been funded much better. That's the body of the Treasury Department that chases money launderers and figures out what's going on. And the Treasury Department has also, with much encouragement, put out new rules to watch for money laundering in the investment and in the residential real estate sectors. So all of those are focused on trying to address this problem of kleptocracy, which affects America in two ways. First, most of the really evil things that have happened to us have emerged from the other side of that frontier: kleptocracy, autocracy, criminality. And second, we have a lot of professionals, licensed white-collar professionals, who are actually on the wrong side in this fight. They're providing services, yacht brokering, art brokering, real estate brokering, financial services to our enemies, and they're providing them the shelter of rule of law. Because the fundamental thing, if you're a really bad guy on the wrong side of this conflict, if you are in rule of crime, there's always somebody who's going to be bigger and meaner. And so what you want to be doing is stashing your getaway, and you want to be stashing your stuff behind rule of law. And what you need there is secrecy, so we're attacking the secrecy so we can get after the crooks. So that's the effort that we're making, and I think it has enormous resonance through a whole variety of countries where corruption and transparency are an issue.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Cassidy, when I've met leaders from emerging economies, they tend to say that when they meet the Chinese, they get a hospital, but when they meet the Americans, they get a lecture. How the Americas Act, in 2 or 3 ways, it's going to concretely make a better offer for the countries of Latin America?
I can give you a whole list of ways, so I'm glad you restricted it to 2 or 3. So, for example, those existing programs which we have now, the Development Finance Corporation, for example, and those corporations, that funding agency, if you will, cannot give to middle income countries. So we cannot make a loan under current law to a country like Chile, but they can go to China. We would change that to allow such a country, Chile, to be able to apply for such a loan. Additionally, we have, and this is all paid for, by the way. This is all paid for, and I can tell you how it's paid for. But we have special loans, we have lines of credit, we have an equity-type investment. We try and have an entrepreneurial wing within the United States government in order to fund. We have risk insurance for a company which may want to move there. Now, folks say, wait a second. If you're going to do business, it's the cost of doing business. They should pay for their own risk insurance. But keep in mind, we're using trade as a tool of foreign policy. We want that company to go there, even if they ordinarily would not, and they will not if they have to buy risk insurance. Having we support them would allow them to move in, advance our cultural interest. Again, General Richardson has spoken about this over and over again. They become an arm of our relationship. We have that risk insurance in here. One more thing which will warm the cockles of White House's heart.
White House.
Yeah, this White House.
Okay, just checking.
Not the White House. No, the White House. One other thing we have, as an example, is and our textile companies are all into this. We set up a way to recycle textiles. I'm told that textiles are the fourth most resource-intensive product produced in the world. And it's not recycled at all now, hardly. We have a way to recycle that which preserves and creates jobs in the U.S., but also helps create jobs in a textile industry in Central America, which has been vacating out to China. And so in that, we actually have tangible things, Roberto, that are going to, if you will, economically bless those countries. And not just a bridge, but rather a tax base which can fund a bridge, and from that funding, that virtuous cycle.
General, you were discussing in your initial remarks about transnational criminal organizations being a challenge for the region. When we think about the defense sector, it needs sometimes to operate on the basis of confidentiality of information. How to strike a balance between confidentiality and transparency?
Yeah, so that's the good question. And the trust that we build with partner nations, also the ability of partner nations, it's the trust, it's the sharing agreements that we have. It's the toolkits or the tools in my toolkit to use with partner nations are our institutional capacity building. It's our international military education and training, our IMET program. And the difference between a chief of defense for an entire country and them having been to a U.S. school and already speak English and understand the trust that's built, that everything is based in human rights and the rule of law, compared to someone who has never been to the U.S. and been part of our training and our education system, professional education for the military. There's a big difference there. And so those are some of the tools that I have, but the transparency is huge. And then that also gets into when you're talking about the protection of information and data and getting into 5G and those sorts of things. They're digital backbone for countries and for the defense networks and things like that too. So obviously very, very important. Really happy that Senator Whitehouse talked about that initiative with the money laundering. When you talk about the over $300 billion annual revenue business that the transnational criminal organizations have, the countries can't compete with that. That is huge money. And we have got to really double down on figuring out that complex following the money and breaking that cycle, because every single country is dealing with all of those illegal activities that are happening, and they're all connected. And we got to help them overcome that. And that's why I think that the more integration of Team USA with the instruments of national power and bringing those together for the very specific things that countries need, so we can help these democracies deliver for their people on their timeline. Because these leaders, these presidents are in the seat for generally one term of 4 years. They're working on a stopwatch, not a calendar. They need response in weeks and months, not years. And a lot of our processes are built on years. And so we spend a lot of time, I spend a lot of time trying to talk about not just talk about it, but how we block our own field goals sometimes, how we get in our own way, Team USA, in support of team democracy. We have got to get faster. Senator Cassidy mentioned the high-income country designations. We have several of them in the region. They haven't realized the benefits of that higher income. And then automatically, some of the things that I can do from the Department of Defense, Department of State, the ability to do investment and being able to help them with military and education gets cut by 50% because they're designated as a high-income country, when really they aren't receiving those benefits just yet, haven't realized them.
The end of the republic will come through interagency process.
Professor Gordon Wood said, in establishing the rule of law, the most difficult are the first 500 years. Senator Whitehouse, in an environment on which we have great power competition, on which countries that are not democracies, that don't respect the rule of law, are interfering in political processes all over the world. And we're also living in a time of post-truth. Last night, we spoke here how Navalny had been accused of corruption when he was fighting corruption in Russia, right? So corruption is also weaponized for political reasons. How do you think the fight for corruption can overcome these challenges that the current moment is generating?
Well, I think step one is to take it a lot more seriously. There are 10,000, roughly, employees within the Drug Enforcement Administration, DEA. There may be 40 who are working on the money side. The Financial Investigative Task Force got started in June. So, and like, I was a prosecutor, I get it, I'm guilty of it. We always grab the product. But we really need to focus on the fact that the money getting back goes into a structure, a well-established international structure designed specifically to hide corrupt money, whether it's kleptocrats or drug dealers or human traffickers or whomever. And it is a very robust institution. And we pay almost no serious official attention to infiltrating it, taking it down, and it is sort of a backbone that supports all of these activities. It gives the crooked people who you're talking about, who use their corruption to interfere not only in their own democracies, but in other democracies, the place where they can safely hide. And it gives reliance on their ability to continue to do that. And it's really pretty evil. And we need to take it down. It's not just Cayman Island bank accounts any longer. It's not just Cypriot corporations any longer. It is a very robust piece of secretive machinery. And we need to make taking it down a priority. And once that's removed, then you can start to pick up the pieces one by one, going after the corrupt officials. But I think that's really an essential piece of their architecture. And if we can take it out, it makes the rest of the battle considerably easier. Regrettably, we have the same problem here in the United States. When the Supreme Court let unlimited money into our politics, it also let unlimited anonymous money into our politics. So we've got the same corruption problem going on of, somebody comes into an election with a super PAC. It's got $50 million to spend. Somebody gave it the $50 million. Nobody has any idea who, except obviously the candidate who knows. And nobody else knows, and it's intensely corrupting. So we've got our own house to clean up, but this international network of financial secrecy should be a prime national security target for us.
On that topic of the international collaboration, General, have you seen with your partners in the region the willingness to tackle this problem and to collaborate to make it a priority?
They're absolutely willing, but they don't have the economies to make their police stronger, to make their military stronger. As we see what happened with Ecuador. Ecuador calls what happened in the December-January timeframe their 9/11. When Senator Chris Dodd and myself, Senator Dodd is the President's Western Hemisphere advisor, we traveled to Ecuador. We were the first visitors there after the crisis had happened. And the President asked, I mean, he's essentially running for president again. He was elected by a sliver. We have a lot to lose with that democracy if we are to lose it. He is finishing the term of the previous president who never had the unity in the Congress and could get nothing passed. And now he's got 18 months. Now it's down to 15 months or so before the next presidential election. And he said, I'd like to have a Plan Ecuador, like Plan Colombia, and how successful Plan Colombia was. So if and that comes with it a whole list of things that happened, investment in security. And so, but then, I talked earlier about economic insecurity. And so the two go hand in hand, though, because you have a lot of these countries that are teetering, I would say, on what happened in Ecuador. And a lot of times presidents are having to mobilize their military to enforce their police and help the police with internal security problems, which is not what militaries are for. But what choice do they have? If they don't have the economies to make their militaries and their police stronger, to get the equipment that they need, a lot of the equipment is outdated, dilapidated in some cases. And then you look at the transnational criminal organizations who are criminalizing poverty. And that makes it so much easier for the People's Republic of China and the Belt and Road Initiative to come in and with the big bags of cash and say, here, we can help you. And then that's how they get the economic foothold in, and then that's how they develop these projects and the critical infrastructure. And I worry about the dual-use application of the critical infrastructure, being able to flip it around for military application when needed. There's reasons why. I mean, if you just think about the 5G, the safe city, smart city technology, the deep water ports, the energy grids, and space. And you just have to ask yourself, why? Why all this significant investment? There's a first megaport that's being constructed right now. It's supposed to be done in November, just north of Lima, Peru. And that will give a straight shot from South America back to China. It'll cut 15 days off of the time that it takes to get the food sources, the rare earth elements, all of those things out of the region. How do we compete with that? Well, we got to be, I would say, and as I've always said, you got to have your jersey on, you got to have your number on, you got to be on the field playing, not in the stands watching. And so how do we get our U.S. companies to bid on these critical infrastructure projects? How do we make it easier? How do we make it? And we have a lot of U.S. companies that are in the region already. We've got over 800 U.S. companies in Colombia, over 250 U.S. companies in Costa Rica, in Panama, over 200. But our branding isn't very good. We aren't talking about Team USA. We're not talking about good U.S. quality investment and what that brings to countries. We know what China does. They bring their own people, their own labor. You have to worry about crises happening in terms of environmental crises, all those kinds of things. U.S. quality investment brings transparency, anti-corruption, environmental standards, labor standards, diversification of workforce, all kinds of things. So that's why I started meeting with AmChams when I go, when I travel into the countries too, to find out how can we help you, and then come back and link up with the interagency and figure out how we can make it easier. But we think about just thinking big in terms of this. Economic Recovery Act of 1948 and what that did for Europe, for war-torn countries in Europe. and having an ability to have and focus investment into the region quickly that is so close. This is our hemisphere. This is the hemisphere that we live in. This is ours. These are our neighbors. And neighbors take care of each other. That's what it means to be in the neighborhood and in this Western hemisphere. And I can fly from Miami. My headquarters is in Miami. I can fly to 80% of this region in 3 to 4 hours. That's how close it is. And our partners want to partner with us. They want us to be there. But we have to have alternatives to the Belt and Road Initiative. We have to compete on the critical infrastructure projects and the tenders, because if there are only Chinese companies competing, then guess what? That's who's going to win the contract. So I try to get the word out in terms of to our companies, the American Chamber of Commerce, working with the Inter-American Development Bank, Developmental Finance Corporation, Ex-Im Bank. They have big money projects, private investment. And then how do we get that into the region for what the countries need quickly? And so I started talking about all of our interagency talking points, not just what the military is doing, because there are some things that I can't do fast enough. But State Department is there, USAID is there, all of these other places are there already doing things. And then bringing this all together for the hemisphere.
Thank you,
to
General.
overcome the challenges.
Thank you. Senator Cassidy, Senator Whitehouse in his remarks talked about putting the house in order here in the U.S.
The what?
Putting the house in order here with respect to corruption as well. Do you see space for bipartisan efforts in that direction?
Yeah, so Sheldon and I are collaborating on a couple of bills, and I've been very interested as well in the trade-based money laundering. And if you think about it, there's different ways to stop drugs from coming to our country. But one way to stop the drugs from coming to the country is to interrupt the financing. If they can't ship the dollars back to buy the drugs, to buy more drugs, to bring them back, to get more money to bring back, well, then if we can stop that money, then we stop it. If you can't finance something, you can't do anything. And so Sheldon and I have different approaches and sometimes the same approach of how do we interrupt that financing of trade-based money laundering.
Thank you. Senator Whitehouse, you're very passionate about climate change and fighting climate change. In order to transition to cleaner sources of energy and industry, massive amounts of investments will be needed. What do you think are the key elements to keep that from falling into corruption and to be transparent?
Well, I think the IRA put enormous amounts of money, and that is all going to be very carefully scrutinized by everybody from the inspectors general of the affected departments to Fox News and our Republican friends who didn't vote for it and are skeptical of it to make sure we're not doing anything wrong with it. I think that the EU is building a similar set of incentives, and I think they'll watch that quite carefully. I think if there's a problem in the climate space with corruption, it is the effort of the industry itself to defend its favored position against the arrival of renewables. And we certainly see that in Congress, non-stop. And I suspect that if you go behind super PACs, front groups, donors trust, 501c4s, 90% of the time, you'll see fossil fuel money, and the prime focus is don't do anything on climate. That's why the IRA bill, unfortunately, had to pass without a single bipartisan vote. So I think there's a really close nexus between the looming climate crisis and what a horrible job we've done of meeting it in the last 15 years, and the use of dark money and its flooding into U.S. politics since January of 2010. So that's where I would put my attention, but I do think that when big money goes out of government, it's very important to police it and watch it carefully to make sure it's not misspent. Quick story on Ukraine. When they were trying to clean up their act, prosecutors from the Rhode Island Attorney General's office, from my old office, went over there to see what was going on and to teach them how to prosecute a criminal case, a public corruption case. And one of the things they found out was that under Ukrainian law, if you had a wiretap on somebody to investigate them for corruption, the first thing you had to do was tell them. So if you want to bake corruption into a society, the very first thing I would think you might do is go to the prosecutors and pass a law saying that they can't investigate you secretly. And sure enough, there it was. So that's been fixed, but it shows how corruption protects itself cyclically, and you really have to go to the heart of it and clear it out.
Thank you. Senator Cassidy, do you have any reaction to what Senator Whitehouse just said?
I share Sheldon's concern regarding climate. We actually have different versions. I call it a foreign pollution fee, he calls it a CBAM, a carbon border adjustment. And so, and we've talked about this often. We will disagree, I think, on how we get there. No one thinks that renewables can power a modern economy. It's almost absurd to say so. Maybe a small service economy, Switzerland, but nobody that has manufacturing. And if you look at what has lowered the United States' emissions since, I think we're lower now since 1990, is the substitution of natural gas for coal. Think about it. We have lower emissions now than we did at least 2005, but I think 1990. And yet we've got a much bigger economy, more oil and gas development, and more manufacturing. And with this, and so we've not decreased our BTUs, we've increased our BTUs. We've just decreased our emissions. Now, I also, just to kind of tie my efforts together, I also think that part of the key, since I think that, and by the way, it's not just me, the International Energy Agency projects increasing uses of fossil fuel through 2050 is how far they take it. The Energy Information Agency of the United States says they'll be increasing fossil fuel through 2050, and that's how far they take it. But how do we do this? Well, Roberto and I were talking earlier. Since our U.S. multinationals have pulled out of Venezuela, the methane leakage, the flaring, the CO2 emissions in the Venezuelan production of their crude has skyrocketed. And I think you told me it's now the highest in the world? Second highest in the world. But if you go right next door to Guyana, I can promise you will look at what Exxon is doing, bringing American environmental standards, and they're going to be one of the lowest in the world. That is the value of exporting U.S. values through our multinationals being involved in trade in other countries. If you look at Mexican steel has a unit of CO2 or greenhouse gas production roughly equivalent to that of the United States for a unit of steel. It's like 1 and 1.2. Contrast that with China, where their greenhouse gas emission per ton of steel is 2.4 that of the US. So as we develop these relationships, our companies and our treaty arrangements bring our environmental standards to Latin America. We need to invest in renewables in Latin America, but we also can't consign them to energy poverty. And I would say we need to develop their natural gas ideally, or better yet, recycling carbon into things like jet fuel. But part of our way of doing that is going to be our multinationals. And to complete the cycle, those multinationals might be there because we decide to encourage them through something like the Americas Act.
Thank you. So transitioning to our last theme of the conversation, we've discussed over these 2 days a lot about democracy and transitions to democracy as well. In the case of Venezuela, we're looking forward to the possibility of a transition this summer. The opposition is united, the country is mobilized, and if we receive the support from our neighborhood and from people who are in this room, I think there's a possibility. But, thank you. But the question is, what can the international community do for countries such as Venezuela and others that transition to democracy, but will have a lot of weaknesses in the institutional setup to avoid relapsing into authoritarianism? What can the international community do to support these transitions?
Well, one would be to help people like you. Roberto's been asking the questions here, but he's actually pretty impressive in his own work. Had to hide in embassies when arrest warrants came after him in Venezuela, feeds tens of thousands of kids through his charity, and is a huge democracy advocate. Obviously, this is always better when it comes up through the local population, through the people. It's hard to apply it from outside, but the resources have to be there, and very often there are similar problems that countries go through as they try to get out of the grip of corrupt dictators and autocrats, and to be able to know what the steps are and what infrastructure is most effective to build so that the people in the country can make intelligent choices based on good information. I think that's probably the best we can do.
Thank you.
I would say the general spoke about how Ecuador would like to have a plan Ecuador, just like we had a plan Colombia. And the general said something earlier, how maybe, I guess this was outside this room, that you should comment that you cannot have a democracy unless you have you have to have security. And you got to ideally have police who are well paid, theoretically incorruptible because they don't have to support themselves with bribes, maintaining order. And you don't have to bring in the military, which may artificially increase the strength of the military. So, General Richardson, I'd love your comments on that, but it seems like aid for security would be critical, and we've seen how that's worked before.
Thank you very much. I wanna thank the McCain Institute, Evelyn and all her team for the opportunity to be here. Just to finish, I wanted to share a story that I recently heard that I think it speaks a lot to what I felt being here. It's the story of three wise persons who are walking in Jerusalem. One of them is Jewish, one of them is Christian, the other is Muslim. And they are, of course, very concerned about intractable conflicts. And one of them turns around and tells the other two that I have decided that I'm going to be an optimist from now on. The other two are very surprised. They keep walking together, and the other two look around and say, well, you said you were going to be an optimist, but you look concerned. And this person turns around and says, who says that being an optimist is easy? Right? It's hard work to be an optimist, but I felt that everyone here is doing a great job of keeping the optimism and the positive energies for change. Thank you very much.